Imagine this. It's a quiet evening, the street is empty, and only one elderly woman is returning home. She was just walking down the street when at that moment a policeman appears, his face expressing something sinister. The tone grows colder and colder, the tension rises, and before anyone can realize what is happening, he suddenly pulls out a pepper spray and sprays it right in the face of this defenseless woman. Only he doesn't know it yet. She has her own personal guards, and they're ready to intervene. Hi everyone. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each and every one of you. You are the reason our channel is growing and spreading such important stories. You are an integral part of our team, and your support is invaluable. Thank you. Every action you take helps us grow stronger and promote the truth. You are more important to us than anyone else. Dusk was slowly fading on the streets of the suburban neighborhood, painting the houses and deserted roads with the soft, warm light of the passing day. An elderly black woman, hunched over under the weight of her years, walked quietly down the quiet street, holding a small bag in her hands. Her face was tired, but in every step there was a quiet confidence and dignity developed over the years. It was her usual way, one she had traveled many times before, just a couple of blocks to the house where her beloved grandchildren were waiting. She hardly noticed the police car parked in the distance, for there was rarely any trouble on these streets. The locals knew each other, and the cops patrolled the neighborhood more for peace than for order. But on this night, something went differently. Hidden in the shadow of the patrol car, the officer followed its slow pace like a predator following prey. He didn't move, only studied her carefully, almost with cold interest. As the woman passed by, barely in time to see him, the policeman took a step forward. His gaze expressed something dark, incomprehensible, but disturbing. He gave her a look full of unspoken judgment, as if looking for a reason to accuse or condemn her, as if her age and skin color alone made her suspicious. The woman slowed her step, looking at him warily. A sense of danger barely glimmered in her mind, but she tried to ignore it and kept walking. Inwardly, she tried to suppress her anxiety. For over the years she had learned to ignore such glances, which she thought should have disappeared with the past, long since faded into oblivion. The policeman, however, was not about to let her go. As soon as she passed, he called out to her in a voice devoid of benevolence or professional courtesy. Like a cold blade, his voice pierced the silence. The woman stopped, feeling her heart clench, and turned slowly to meet a look of contempt, as if to say that he knew everything about her just by looking at her face. She didn't yet know that this wasn't just an ID check. To this man, she was something less than a passerby. The policeman, tall and stout, stood with a cold, hard stare, sweeping her from head to foot. His eyes glittered with an icy light that had not a shadow of sympathy in it. There was a judgment in his gaze, too familiar and all too clear to this woman who had lived so many years in a country where skin color could still mean so much more than mere appearance. In a split second, stereotypes flashed through his mind, like long-prepared images built on prejudice and rejection. The old cloak the woman had worn for years, her tired appearance, her dark skin, all of it seemed something suspicious in his eyes, something that required immediate intervention. He didn't need to ask questions. He already knew he wasn't going to let her pass quietly. The policeman didn't even think about the fact that the woman in front of him was just an old woman walking home. His inner world was already filled with assumptions that he was ready to erect into dogma. He took a step forward, looking down at her intently, the way one looks down at something secondary, like a nuisance or a problem that he, as a representative of the law, was called upon to solve. In his mind, she was not an innocent citizen. In her, he saw an enemy, a threat to be subdued without giving the slightest chance of resistance. Her age, her fatigue, all these things seemed to irritate him, making him want to impose his superiority on her. His hand slowly rested on the belt where the pepper spray hung, and he grinned faintly. The muffled satisfaction of his own power over this fragile woman made him feel even more confident. He was already imagining how easy it would be to show her her place, how easy it would be to break her calm gaze into a pleading one. He didn't need to explain or question his actions. Her background, her age, and her vulnerability were enough excuses for him. The woman sensed it before he took the next step. Her heart raced, but she didn't look away, realizing he wouldn't let her go. She saw in his face something she'd seen many times before, but something that hurt her for the first time: disdain, contempt, and unconcealed anger. The policeman stepped forward, leaving barely a couple of steps between him and the woman. His lips contorted into a cold, barely perceptible sneer that reflected his contempt. He spoke in a low, imperious voice that radiated disdain, as if he were not a human being but something lesser, something not worth listening to. "Where are you going, Grandma?" His words sounded deliberately rude with a touch of sarcasm. He seemed not to be asking a question, but trying to convey to her that her presence on this street annoyed him. "Don't you think it's too late for a walk?" he added, raising an eyebrow with fake surprise. The woman met his gaze silently, not giving him the satisfaction of either fear or protest, but it infuriated him even more. The policeman frowned and, licking his lips, continued, "I'm talking to you? Are you even listening to me?" His voice became sharper, like the blow of a whip. "I don't think you have any rights to be loitering around here at this hour." She continued to stand in front of him, a sad determination glowing in her eyes. Her silence seemed a challenge to him. Now he was sure he had to show who was in charge. "What if I decide you're up to something here?" His voice grew more aggressive with each phrase. "Old, but who knows what you're capable of, huh?" He leaned closer, keeping his hand on the pepper spray. His gaze was full of desire to break her, to make her submit. "You know, I could just take you down to the station right now, or maybe just freshen you up a little," he said, tapping his fingers on the canister as if telling her what choice she should make. He was pretty sure she'd flinch, that she'd get scared and beg him for mercy. But seeing that she wasn't backing down and her gaze was still calm, he felt his patience turn to anger. "Don't you realize who you're talking to?" he hissed, raising his voice. "I am the law here, and you will do as I say." The policeman, sensing that his words had no effect, felt an urgent desire to show his power in another way. His patience was wearing thin, and he decided to move on to actions that he thought would make the woman realize who was in charge. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm roughly, harder than necessary, causing her pain. Her frail body, unaccustomed to such violence, staggered, but she stood without making a sound. That only made him angrier. He yanked her forward sharply, causing her to lose her balance and nearly fall. "You think you can just ignore me?" he hissed in her face, squeezing her hand so hard her knuckles turned white. He knew she couldn't break free, but he deliberately tightened his grip to feel her helplessness. His every move was a desire to humiliate and crush her. The woman kept her gaze fixed on him, holding back the pain, which only irritated him more. He pushed her against the wall, pressing her so that her back hit the cold concrete. She squirmed in pain for a second, but quickly opened her eyes again, full of sadness and fatigue, but not fear. It made him inwardly furious. She wasn't afraid, and it seemed to him that fear should be her only response. Not content with that, he took her by the shoulders, pressing her against the wall, and raised the pepper spray to the level of her face. "You probably think you can just walk away like nothing happened, don't you?" he said dismissively, bringing his face close to hers so she could feel his breath, his arrogance. He knew that the can would cause her sharp, excruciating pain, that it would make her vulnerable, and he was overwhelmed with satisfaction at the thought that he could break her. His fingers reached for the button of the canister, and in that moment, he realized there was nothing that could stop him. The policeman looked at the woman with a predatory expression, as if anticipating the effect of his next action. Her tired but hard stare was infuriating him, and he realized that only one thing could finally make her break. Without hesitation, he pressed the button for the pepper spray, releasing the caustic stream directly into her face. The woman cried out, instinctively closing her eyes and turning away, but the acrid gas instantly entered her airways, burning her and causing sharp, excruciating pain. She coughed, gulping for air, which did nothing to alleviate her condition. Panic washed over her, tears streaming down her face, washing away the remnants of her former calm, leaving only despair and utter helplessness. Her mind was filled with the thought of the terrible pain that was burning her from the inside out. The policeman did not back down. He watched her torment without a shadow of regret, as if everything that was happening was justified, like a punishment she deserved. Her screams and helpless movements did not move him, but rather filled him with cold satisfaction. He felt power. He felt like the arbiter of justice, sure he was doing what needed to be done. The woman tried to turn away, but he grabbed her shoulder sharply, holding her in place, preventing her from escaping another wave of pain. Her hands trembled, tears flooded her face, but she could find no escape, could not even think of calling for help. Her voice trailed off into a pathetic croak, and she tried to whisper something, but the words were drowned out by coughing and sobbing. The officer stared at her with cold certainty, still convinced he was doing the right thing. His cruelty was unfeeling, devoid of any awareness of the pain he was inflicting. In that moment, he was deaf to her suffering and tears, not seeing her as a person, but as an object to be obeyed at all costs. The noise, screams, and desperate sobs of the old woman attracted the attention of the few passers-by who happened to be nearby. People froze, stunned by the scene unfolding before them. On this quiet evening, when everyone was accustomed to the calm and measured pace of life in their neighborhood, no one expected to see such a scene. A woman struggling to break free, and a policeman whose brutality seemed completely unreasonable and cruel. They stood aside, not knowing how to react. It was clear that he was an authority figure, which meant that everyone had to obey. The fear of the policeman paralyzed many of them, restraining them and making them watch in confusion. But in their eyes, it was not fear of the woman they were trying to bring to her knees, but horror at the ruthlessness of the officer's actions. One of the witnesses took a step forward, unable to watch the suffering of an elderly woman in silence. The man took out his cell phone, deciding to record what was happening to at least capture the moment. He picked up the phone and recorded how the woman tried unsuccessfully to wipe away her tears and the pain, which did not subside, while the policeman, showing not a shadow of compassion, continued to hold her without even loosening his grip. Others who saw the footage were also brave. They realized that it would be difficult for one person to stand up to a police officer, but if there was footage, if there were more of them, they could show the world the brutality that was happening before their eyes. Over and over again, the cameras captured her every scream, his every move, the woman's every attempt to free herself. Passers-by were stunned, some turned away, unable to bear the sight. Some whispered words of encouragement that the woman, consumed by pain, could hardly hear. People wanted to help, but fear of the police uniform and the possible consequences for themselves and their families kept them at a distance. The policeman was fully absorbed in his sense of power and superiority when he suddenly heard a shout behind him. He turned around, and saw two men in private security uniforms approaching at a brisk pace. One of them, stout and determined, held a security guard's ID card, which he held up in front of him, showing his authority. The other, a little younger, was already surveying the situation and casting anxious glances at the elderly woman, whose face was contorted with pain and whose eyes were red from the acrid gas. "Hey, what's going on here?" the older of the guards asked sharply, his voice full of indignation. The policeman froze for a moment, not used to anyone questioning his actions. He felt the tension in the air. Many eyes were fixed on him, not only the passers-by, but also these guards, whose faces expressed determination and righteous anger. "That's none of your business. Stand back," the policeman said coldly, clearly not about to relent. But the guards did not budge, their faces adamant. The older guard replied calmly but firmly, "This woman is under our protection, and we will not allow you to continue to abuse her. We have every legitimate reason to intervene." The policeman felt his anger starting to return to him, but the situation was out of his control. One of the guards had already cautiously approached the woman, trying to calm her down. He helped her lean on himself, protecting her from further attack. Her haggard face expressed relief, though pain still clouded her gaze. The senior guard, keeping his eyes on the policeman, added firmly, "Your actions are caught on camera, and we are prepared to file a complaint for abuse of authority and physical harm. We can continue this right here, or you can back off and end this incident without further consequences." The crowd, seeing that the guards had taken control of the situation, cheered up. People whispered and exchanged indignant glances, feeling that justice might finally prevail. The policeman, sensing that all eyes were now upon him with judgment and wariness, hesitated. His power and self-confidence began to crumble under the onslaught of this sudden and determined resistance. Realizing that the situation was finally out of his hands, he slowly put the pepper spray away and took a step back, jaw clenched. The policeman straightened, looking at the guards with a frank rage that was slowly turning to despair. His face, still cold and arrogant, tensed, and he took a step forward, trying to maintain the illusion of control. He seemed about to rejoin the fight, but the guards met his gaze calmly, their resolve unwavering. "You don't seem to realize who you're talking to," his voice, though calm, shook with restrained anger. The policeman made an attempt to scare them by subtly placing his hand on his holster. He was sure he could intimidate the guards the same way he thought he could intimidate others. But the older guard, keeping his composure, took another step forward, cutting off the elderly woman completely. He looked at the policeman directly, without a shadow of fear, and spoke in a low, calm voice. "Sir, your actions are outside the law. We're documenting everything, and if you don't back down, it will be in the report." His words, calm and firm, caused the policeman to protest internally, but he had no time to respond before the young guard added, "We are here to protect her. She's in our custody, and we won't let you continue the violence." There was just as much determination in his eyes, and the policeman felt his power and confidence melting under that twin gaze. The crowd, sensing that the situation had changed, began to whisper even louder, supporting the guards. The faces of the people showed approval and hope for justice, which only made the policeman more angry. He realized that any wrong move he made would not only be a personal failure, but would also create legal problems for him. Seeing that the guards were not going to back down, he unclenched his teeth and, still looking at them with hatred, slowly backed up a step. The guards kept their guard up, staying between him and the older woman. They held steady, their faces calm, but determined. "We won't let you hurt her anymore," the older guard said. softening his tone slightly, but not taking his eyes off her. The policeman felt that an invisible circle had formed around him, in which his power was losing strength. His gaze darted between the guards and the people who were filming what was happening. He realized that he had failed, and that this day would not end the way he had planned. The next day, the incident, captured by multiple phones, began to spread across social media. The video of an elderly woman in pain after being attacked by a police officer instantly attracted media and public attention. Angry comments and calls for justice multiplied by the hour, and people who saw the officer's brutal behavior were not going to let the incident go unchallenged. A formal complaint was soon filed against the police officer. The woman's family hired attorneys who sought punishment for abuse of authority and physical and emotional harm. The public outcry increased the pressure, and the police department could no longer ignore the situation. An internal investigation was launched to look into the police officer's actions and to determine why he felt he had the right to attack a defenseless person. Social media and major news outlets covered the case, and thousands of allegations were levied against the police officer. Civil rights organizations spoke out about the need for policy changes and greater oversight of police actions, especially when it came to discrimination and violence. The officer came under a barrage of scrutiny, and his reputation was rapidly eroding. Under the pressure of public opinion, the police department was forced to issue a statement. The police chief said that the incident would be thoroughly investigated and assured that any officer who exceeded his authority would be punished. This statement, however, did not satisfy the public, and people continued to demand immediate action. The policeman, feeling the mounting pressure, realized that this case could ruin his career. His colleagues began to stay away from him, and his superiors suspended him from duty for the duration of the review. Every day he saw headlines, accusations, and comments that made him look like a cold-blooded aggressor. He tried to justify himself, but realized that the public had already passed judgment on him. The investigation continued, and every fact gathered, every detail of the incident only made it worse. The case of the elderly woman became not just an isolated episode of police violence, but a symbol of a deeper problem that had been ignored for too long. Public support and media attention gave the incident weight, and activists and human rights groups, determined to use the story to bring about change, began to openly discuss the systemic problems that pervade law enforcement. The main issue that people raised was how a police officer could feel entitled to humiliate and intimidate a person, especially an elderly and clearly non-threatening person. The speeches of public figures and human rights defenders raised important issues about how prejudice and racial stereotypes still exist in the minds of some officers of the law, and how often this leads to tragic consequences. Meetings, rallies, online conferences, conversations about police reform began across the country. The community called for greater accountability among police officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and respect for everyone, regardless of age, race, or social status. Many proposed the introduction of a system of oversight that would record every instance of police intervention and prevent abuses. This case demonstrated the importance of transparency in policing and the need for trust between the public and law enforcement. Activists and journalists emphasized that irresponsible actions, such as those committed by the officer, undermine trust in the police by creating fear and resentment rather than serving as support and protection for the community. Over time, politicians and government officials joined the discussion and supported reforms, proposing bills to tighten controls and prevent bias. Although change could not happen immediately, this case was a strong impetus for progress. Society realized that everyone, regardless of their position, race, or age, should be guaranteed respect and safety. The elderly woman whose case became the starting point for this movement epitomized those who have been overlooked and whose voices have been ignored for too long. Now her story has become a reminder that every voice and every life matters. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you or someone you love experienced racism or injustice? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. We need to hear every voice you have. You help us grow the channel and talk about what really matters. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful for your attention and support. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. We wish you a great day, and may justice always be on your side.